Hey everybody, Corey here coming at you with another knife review video. Today we are taking a look at the Skiff made blades Culprit. If you're new around here, consider subscribing. I try to put out new knife related content on a regular basis. As always, we're going to start with size comparisons. This is another pricey boy. So we're going to do two size comparisons of knives that you might be familiar with. Here it is next to the Ontario Knives Rat number 2. Relatively small knife, especially compared to the Culprit. Here it is next to the Spyderco PM2. Again, smaller than the PM2. All the knives that I review are either like smaller than the PM2, bigger than the Rat 2. It's how they all, it's the sweet spot, right? Next up, I'm going to show you two knives that kind of fall into this similar price range that you might be familiar with if you're considering buying this. Here it is next to a Koenig Knives Arius. Clearly, it is not as big as the Arius. And then last but not least, here is, I don't know, somewhere in my head I call this the direct competitor, the brother from another mother. This is the Holt Knives Morpheus, and I'm going to be making a lot of comparisons between these two knives throughout the course of the video because I think it's very relevant. Now, to get this whole thing started, I'm going to start with those kinds of comparisons, right? So these are two, they're very similar, but they're also very different, right? It's clear that the Holt is a more straightforward design. The Culprit, while also exhibiting some features that the Morpheus exhibits, it's just so clear that it's edgier. It's more designed, if that makes sense. It's more catching to the eye. There's a little bit more going on. That being said, that inherently puts the Culprit in a spot where it's more polarizing, right? It's much easier to look at the Morpheus and say, yeah, I don't know, I guess it's fine, right? Because it's a very normal looking knife. Whereas with the Culprit, this is kind of a design that you look at and you almost immediately say, wow, I love it, or yikes, I hate it. Maybe hate is an interesting word because I would struggle to really dislike this thing. I think it still has a pretty clean look, but it's clearly a more polarizing design. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing, I just want to get this out of the way. This is 800-ish, right? These go up and down, and they have different prices depending on the times and the finishes, all that stuff. It's somewhere between $700 to $900, depending on where and when you pick it up, right? Okay? Just like the Morpheus, again, this falls in a similar realm in terms of quality. It's very hard to find things that are wrong with this knife from a manufacturing perspective, right? Let's get that hair off there. Now, don't confuse that with design choices. There are some design choices that I'm not a fan of with the Culprit, and we'll talk about those for a second. But in terms of the way that the design was executed, just want to put it out there, I have no complaints. There's no blade play, no lock rock. It's dead centered. Screws don't come loose. There's no imperfections in the milling, at least not to my eyes. They have the little details like the flat portion underneath the pocket clip so it doesn't get caught on your jeans. It's got what you would expect in terms of milling between two parts on a price or a knife at this price point. The milling is continued flawlessly between the separate piece of titanium that's also been inlaid and anodized. It's a great piece. There's nothing I can say looking at this thing where I say, you know what, they really fell short. Now, let's get the Morpheus off the table and let's focus on the Culprit. Let's talk about the Culprit primarily. So just assume everything is great, and I'm just going to talk about, some things that kind of stood out to me. So the action on the Culprit, it reminds me of, no, I don't want to say it reminds me of a Sebenza. It makes me think about what I thought I was getting when I got my first Sebenza. People talk about Chris Reeves Sebenzas being, hydraulic and, oh, it's the smoothest knife you'll ever own. No, the Skiff Culprit is one of the smoothest knives you'll ever know. The Skiff Culprit is everything that I wished my Sebenza would have been before I sold it. And it's half the reason why I sold it, because it just didn't live up to the hype. But in terms of the action, it also is comparable to a Sebenza in the sense that it has a relatively stiff action. Not when you put your thumb on the lock bar, right? When you depress the lock, it just swings, right? But when your finger's off the lock, the pressure from the lock bar is relatively tight. So maybe not the world's most amazing fidgeter unless you're into something that you can kind of shake shut. But fidgeting aside, it has a very glassy, smooth, I wouldn't even quite call it hydraulic. I don't know. It's smooth. Okay, it's smooth. Not gravity shut when your thumb is off of it, but it's good. The blade shape. I think this is an awesome blade shape, both from an aesthetic perspective, which is subjective, but also from a use perspective. It almost is slanted in a downward direction, at least when you grab the knife the way that it wants to be held. It kind of lends itself to kind of being angled downwards. It's just kind of begging to cut things. And not that this is an exceptional slicer, in my opinion, but it doesn't have, crazy thick blade stock. It doesn't have a crazy aggressive grind either, but it is a good cutter. Okay, so I will say that. I do wish there was some jimping here. A lot of these high-end knives, it's almost like they're designed to look like they're meant to be used, but there are things missing from them that I wish would be on them if they were actually intended to be used, such as jimping. Maybe that's just a design choice, but it is particularly, it's slippery. It's a very high polish. There's really no traction. Thankfully, the handle has a kind of angular design that really kind of locks you in. And oh, by the way, this can be used as a full forward finger choil. This becomes a different knife. When you're choked up on this thing, this becomes one of the most impressive, arguably one of the best forward finger choils I've ever felt on a knife. It suddenly just melts into your hand. It almost feels like it was made to be exclusively used with the finger choil, because somehow it manages to actually feel more comfortable in the finger choil than it does when you're not in the finger choil, at least for me. In terms of the finishing, the handle itself, it's fine, right? It's a relatively subdued design. At least mine is, right? You can get these in any of the finishes you want. I love the milling though, and let's say for now this is the last comparison I'll make. The Holt Morpheus. It has very crisp but very fine milling, and it's a little shallow. It's almost smooth when you're not really grabbing it. It's almost slippery if you're not really trying to give it the death grip. The Culprit, on the other hand, I mean, you can see the ridges, you can hear the ridges. This thing just screams texture no matter how you're grabbing it, no matter how you're holding it. I'm not going to say that's good or bad, but it is very unique. I've never felt a knife with texturing that was this dramatic on the handle, unless we're talking about like actual checkering or anything. But again, in terms of anodization, in terms of fit and finish, things like that, it just checks all the boxes, right? Everything is executed flawlessly. This pivot collar acts as an over travel stop. That's nice. There's really nothing to complain about. When it comes to the blade again, though, we'll take a look at the blade one more time. Their hand finishing, oh my God, it is silky smooth. It is milky smooth. This is the most attractive hand-rubbed blade. I think I can say it's the most attractive hand-rubbed blade I have ever seen in my knife career. It's beautiful. It's absolutely silky. Now, that being said, if you're the kind of person, be honest with yourself, if you're the kind of person who struggles to use your high-end knives, whatever high-end means to you, this is going to make it kind of hard to use. If you're afraid to beat up your knife, you're gonna see a scratch in that finish relatively quickly if that's something you choose to do. Now, if you're the kind of person who uses your knives, you don't really care about any of that. But if you're someone who struggles with that, I'm just pointing it out. Look at that near mirror polish too. You can see my camera, you can see everything. It's just absolutely beautiful. So overall, it's a great piece. There are some design choices that I'm going to get into that kind of have me scratching my head. Starting with the backspacer. I don't know why the backspacer doesn't go all the way up to here, and I specifically say that not just because I want more backspacer, but because it is relatively easy to touch the tip of the blade while the knife is closed. You might argue that, they might lose due to the geometry, maybe a millimeter of blade if they brought the backspacer all the way up there, but honestly, that's a trade I'm willing to take. One, I think it would just look better if the backspacer went all the way to the back, and two, you wouldn't really have to worry about touching the blade. Number two, it's a design choice, and if you don't care, then who cares, right? But there's no sharpening choil, and that means that if you do plan on using this thing and you end up sharpening it, you're just going to keep creating a bigger and a bigger and a bigger smile over time. Now, I doubt anyone's ever going to use one of these to the point where that actually matters. Plus, I think aesthetically, it looks nice. It's a very nice flowing design, and I think it could kind of come to a skirt if there was just a sharpening choil right there. So on one hand, I get it. On the other hand, it's just another thing that makes me go, do you really want me to use this knife? And then last but not least, there is no lock bar insert. I will say, this has a tiny, 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 tiny itty bitty little bit of lock stick, okay? Kind of being dramatic about that, but it's not non-existent, but it's kind of the nature when you don't have a lock bar insert. Now, technically, I have been informed by some people with decent reputation for knife making that you don't need a lock bar insert if you can make the lock bar geometry absolutely flawless, the way that it interacts with the tang. That's all fine and dandy, but I mean, why not? Why not? Everybody else is doing it. It's not that hard. It's going to, people like me, reviewers are going to call it out every time. Just put it in there. Just put it in there. I've heard that they've started doing that on some of the newer models, so that might just be something you need to keep an eye out for on older models. This is number 62, but just something to consider, especially at this price point. It's one of those things where I'm like, I mean, maybe if you designed this on purpose, but it feels, I don't want to say amateur. I don't like saying the word amateur, but it's like, you know what people are looking for, and I get it. Maybe you're going to stick to your guns and you just don't want to put a lock bar insert in there and all that other stuff, but just something to consider when you're making a purchase like this. That being said, none of those things are deal breakers. I have never actually, stabbed myself on the tip of the blade. I've never had this thing have lock stick to the point where, it makes me want to pull my hair out or I can't unlock it. And obviously, I'm not running into any sharpening issues because I'm just not gonna touch this thing. But overall, very sexy design in my opinion. It's very edgy, right? Again, it's like a brother from another mother with the Holt Morpheus, right? It's the more exotic member of the family. And again, just to be clear, these aren't the same makers. Skiff and Holt, they're two separate things. But I really do compare them to one another. This is the brother who decided he wanted to join a rock band and dye his hair. And this is the brother who was just on the straight and narrow his entire life. And I don't know, he went to law school or something. I'm being wild about this, but I think you get the idea. In terms of build quality, they're absolutely the same. And I don't think you're getting ripped off in any direction. So if you want one, go get it. It's a very sleek piece. They're very interesting. Kind of hard to come by, but I don't think they're as hard to come by as some of the other knives in this price range. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this. I will see you all next time.